And good morning. I'm Peter McLaughlin, citizen producer, Newtown, Connecticut. Today is September 9th, 2015, and we're here in South Windsor, Connecticut, at the home of Mr. Jim Dina. And today's topic will be harvesting Native American crops. So without further ado, let's get started.
It's harvest time on the Connecticut River meadows, and already we're enjoying some of the bounty of that garden we planted last spring. And all three sister vegetables are in our clay cooking pot here, simmering up with other ingredients into a nice rich stew for us to try a little bit later. And hanging behind me is already some of the corn that we've harvested. It's drying out just for a little while. Flint corn, of course, is quite dry as it comes off the stalks. We only have to dry it for a little while. And eventually we'll store it for the winter. And one of the best places to do that is in a birch bark container like this. It's a sewn container, and we'll take it off the cobs and put it inside here like this, so you don't need the cobs for anything else. And there'll be a lot of it in here, and we'll keep this around inside the wigwam. And of course, when it comes to grain, rodents are always a problem, but rodents don't like the smell of birch bark. So once we put the top on here, our corn is pretty safe throughout the rest of the season. All right. Looks like this will be pretty good when it's done. We have a little more harvesting to do though, and we're nearly there, and I think we can go outside and see how the garden looks and finish up our harvesting. It's early morning, and we're out in our native garden, which looks quite beautiful. It's grown tall. We've had very good weather. We've had enough rain at the right time, and the harvest looks pretty fine, and we'll finish up doing a little harvesting here, all right? Of course, first of interest is the corn. We have quite a few ears here, huh? Beautiful corn. And it's not a big job to harvest this stuff at all. Just a matter of breaking them out. All right. And we'll get rid of some of the things we don't need. That's a small one. We didn't get that good a pollination, but plenty of kernels on that one. It was worth it. And there's some better ones over in here, I think. We'll just take a look. There's a beautiful one. That wonderful blue corn. Often there's some white in there with it. This one's just almost totally blue. And we'll leave the husks here. We use those for other things eventually. All right, very nice corn. And there's profusion of beans. Here's the beans. They've climbed up the corn as well as climbed up the poles that I left out. And these are those absolutely beautiful cranberry beans that we saw last spring during planting. They're just a most beautiful thing. You can see why they're called cranberry beans. They have the same color. There they are. There are quite a few of them. All right. And there's more back in here. Almost every hill has some cranberry beans on it. And harvesting is really kind of easy work compared to the planting. That's where most of the work is involved. And during high summer, as we mentioned in our last episode, the squash plants filled in all the spaces between these corn hills. Now once the squash fruits are developed, the squash vines start to die back, and they've done us a real service though in shading out the garden, keeping moisture in here, and of course producing the squashes. And there's still a squash plant back through here that's actually growing. It hasn't died back yet, but and there's not much left of it, but we usually cut off some of the stem with the squash plant, and it'll shrivel and dry tight, and that keeps the moisture inside the squash itself, so it doesn't dry out too much over the winter. But the beauty of all three of these crops is that they can be stored throughout the winter and almost into next spring without drying out. Now, if it seems like we've kind of come full circle here, that's exactly what's happened, because as we observed last spring, these three beautiful plants, the corn, the beans, and the squashes, will not only be fodder and food for this winter, but they'll be the seeds for next year's garden. That's some more good corn. Oh my, it looks like we've had some visitors in our garden. And here are a couple of deer hoof prints right there. Another one there. And so the deer probably come in during the night. And they don't likely stay too long. They may sniff at the corn and eat a little. But they could also pick up our scent in the wigwam. If there are people around, they're quite nervous and won't stay and do too much damage to the garden. So, and over here, my goodness, we've had other visitors who can't smell at all. They're turkeys. And as you can see from the feathers, at this time of year, the turkeys are getting ready to grow their winter feathers to stay warm, and they molt. And during that period, they like to scratch dust up under their skin to get rid of parasites and improve their new feathers. And you can see the turkey tracks right through the garden here. My goodness, what a mess they've made. But there's no better place to dust in than dry corn hills. And at the moment, the deer and turkeys are somewhat unwelcome visitors, but that will change pretty soon. So that's really pretty much all there is to harvesting, and we've even harvested our native tobacco, and it's drying here nicely, and we got quite a crop. And after it's a little drier, we'll bring it inside the wigwam so that the rain doesn't spatter it. And every now and then we'll burn a little, just for the wonderful aroma that it creates. While we're on the topic of harvesting, we should also talk about harvesting wild plants. And we mentioned when we planted this garden last spring that the corn, the beans, and the squash, the three sisters, and the tobacco belong exclusively to myself and my family, because it would have been my wife that tended and planted this garden, and I would have helped out with other chores. But around us in this single clearing are a profusion of wild plants, and anyone in the village or even in the tribe could have helped themselves to those, because I didn't plant those. So let's take a look at just the plants that we could have found in this single clearing and a few footsteps beyond. And one of the most wonderful plants is this one here. It is called the ground nut, and it almost looks like a nut. It has an extremely distinctive foliage, and it's actually a vine, and believe it or not, it's a bean plant. Now, the wild bean seeds are minuscule and tiny, but instead of storing its energy in the pods like our domestic beans, it stores it underground in these little potato-like things. They taste like half a potato and half a nut. And from that single vine, I dug up all of these. So there's usually a large one on top, and then all these small ones following behind. So can you believe all of those from just one single vine? So that's the ground nut, and it has a starch-like quality and a nut-like quality. And in that sense, it will balance the diet very nicely. So that's one of my favorites. Another is called lamb's quarters. It's a wild spinach, and it actually tastes like spinach. So very good green. And if you're out in the wilds and you've missed lunch and find some of this and just have a sip of water, it'll swell the spinach up, and it almost feel as though you've had a real meal, which you haven't. Another plant which we can harvest especially earlier in the year is called milkweed. And the milkweed flowers, which have already dropped off, are edible. They're gone now. The young pods, when they're teeny, are edible. At this stage, they're not edible because the seeds are developed. This would taste like eating cotton, and you don't want to do that, huh? So those pods are beyond the eating stage, but the stalks are still good. And we can cut these stalks down, which is quite easy, and we can boil them up. It takes 2 changes of water because milkweed has this sap in it that's kind of bitter tasting. So in 1 change of water, and then in a second, and the stalks are pretty edible. So a nice plant. All right. And for drinking purposes, here's a thing called staghorn sumac. These wonderful red berries, it's just a matter of throwing them in some water, stirring it around, and it's like a pink lemonade without the sugar in it. And if the name staghorn sounds curious, it's because whoever named it thought that the fuzzy branches looked like the new horns that a deer stag grows when they're in the velvet, as they call it, as they're developing. So there's our pink lemonade, right? And for flavoring in our stews, this is a plant called wood sorrel. It almost looks like a little 4-leaf clover, and again, that has a very, very nice lemony taste to it. And one of the most wonderful plants around us is not right on this clearing here, but we talked about a second garden we have down below on the floodplain. And just a few steps into the floodplain is the ubiquitous cattail. And there is absolutely nothing poisonous in the cattail. And the cattail's roots are again starchy, somewhat like a potato. And they're loaded with kind of these strings you can see here. And I still haven't figured out how to eat these things. Well, you can see the starch just falling out of there. And it's like a potato with strings in it, I guess. And you pull the strings out of your teeth at the end. And at the tip of the cattail roots is this little thing which tastes like it should go in a salad. It's kind of a green of a sort, even though it's not really green. And they're very nice and fresh to eat. Right? And it doesn't stop there. Inside the cattail stalk is another little green spike. And it can taste somewhat like celery on the newer stalks. It's just the bottom part that's edible. But it's in there somewhere, and it's just the soft part that's nice and edible. So a very useful plant, and there's no swamp around that doesn't have a profusion of cattails. And if that weren't enough, there's even another plant in the swamp down there just below the floodplain garden, and it's wild rice. That's collected also in the fall. So those are the food plants that we can find right around this garden clearing. I will mention a couple others only because they're found here. This is the bark of a willow tree, and in the bark is a primitive form of aspirin, believe it or not. It's just necessary to chew off the bark and chew up a wad, and that tastes exactly like an aspirin, and it does exactly the same thing. It'll cure a headache, other minor ailments too. So willow bark for aspirin. And this is not an edible plant, but it's the antidote for poison ivy, and it grows in the shaded spots all over here. I call it jewelweed. Many horticulturalists call it touch-me-not, because when this orange flower is ripe and you touch it, it shoots its seed pods all over the place to spread them around. So jewelweed for the antidote to poison ivy. And one last plant, not edible either. It's a relative of the milkweed plant, but it's a poisonous relative, but it's easy to tell apart. It has a red stem, and it's called dogbane, or more telltale, Indian hemp. And just as the name indicates, it's used for making thread, ropes, cordage, as we call it. So a useful plant for tying materials. There are others. Native peoples use many other plants, probably hundreds, but I mention these only because they're growing right close to us and are easy to harvest. Now, the comparison between wild harvesting and domestic harvesting is much more striking than it might seem. To harvest these plants, there's no planting to do, none whatsoever. They plant themselves. We may have to look a little bit to find them, but that's usually not very hard. And as soon as the soil thaws in the springs, the women would go out and start digging plants available at that time. And before agriculture was introduced here, we would say that people lived in what was called a hunter-gatherer economy. The hunting part's fairly obvious. The gathering just refers to the digging up and gathering back of wild plants. And the women would have began in early spring, harvested other plants all through the summer, and still others that were available in the early months of fall until the first frost locked in the soil again. So there is nothing to harvesting them. You don't have to plant them, you just have to collect them. Right? Now, the other side of the equation is a little different. With all that work of harvesting or planting and then harvesting our domestic crops, the size of the fruits is much larger than any one of these. So with all the wild plants that I have here, I do have a meal, but just one ear of corn and one squash from our domestic garden with the large size of the fruits can feed a man for an entire day. The harvest was quite good this year, but I am noticing something that's become a trend. It's that the fruits of the garden, especially the corn and the squashes, are becoming smaller, and this trend has been going on for a couple of years now, and often the ears were bigger than this a few years ago, and we can see from the squash plants down here too that they're a little diminutive. That is in spite of the good weather we've had this year. We should have had larger fruit, and a lot of them are much smaller, and this can only mean one thing, that the fertility of the garden is diminishing. We're depleting the nutrients in the soil, and there's only one solution for this that Native American peoples had, and that was to move the garden. And if I move the garden very far, which eventually would be necessary, I will have to move the village as well.